Hi everyone, my name is Beth Olson and I am the Water Safety Officer here at Wayne State in the Office of Environmental Health and Safety. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we are just going to briefly cover our domestic water flushing program, what the program itself looks like, and kind of why we are doing it here on campus during periods of low occupancy, which can be anytime, but right now it's the shutdown due to COVID-19. My name and contact information is here for you, my email and my phone number. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or suggestions. So I'm going to cover our program, our flushing program, but first I wanted to discuss why we're flushing. So this bacteria that's pictured here is Legionella, which is the driving force behind why we've adopted a flushing program. And it's also the reason that the water safety team was formed in response to a Legionella problem we had here on campus in 2018. So I'm going to review Legionella and kind of why it's important that we're aware of this bacteria and how to stay safe from this bacteria. What is Legionella? I mentioned it's a bacteria. It is found naturally and in man-made water sources. We actually get it from the supply of city water that comes from the city. It can grow when conditions are right. Some conditions include stagnant water, so water that isn't being moved, or is sitting in tanks or pipes. The premium growth range is listed here, 68 degrees to 122 degrees. That is when Legionella really grows very well. It doesn't necessarily die either outside of that growth range. So there's a really big range of temperature that Legionella can survive in, and this is the 68 to 122 degrees is the premium range that it can grow very well. Another condition is low disinfectant. So when we get that supply from the city, it includes a disinfectant residual like chlorine. There's a little bit of chlorine that they add to our water supply to keep it safe for us. And when we don't have the right amount of chlorine or disinfectant in our water, it can actually be a condition that Legionella can grow very well because there isn't that disinfectant there to kill it. Some diseases that Legionella cause are Legionnaire's disease, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the kind of lesser form of Pontiac fever, which we'll talk about. I wanted to include this, I talked about the temperature growth range for Legionella, and you can see the ideal growth range is right here, 95 to 115. That's just like premium jacuzzi temperature for Legionella. They love it. The entire growth range is listed here, 68 to 122, as I mentioned. And you can see that it doesn't really start to die until it reaches like 131 degrees. So it can survive but not multiply or make more Legionella. It starts to die at 131 degrees. You can see the higher the temperature, the more rapidly that Legionella will die. Some ways that building facilitators can try and get rid of Legionella is to do like a thermal shock, where you're actually putting really high temperatured water through your domestic hot water to kill Legionella. And here on the other end, you can see that Legionella survive but are dormant below 68 degrees. So cold water in storage tanks, piping, fountains, you want to keep your cold water below 68 degrees. I'm just going to touch on some of the risk factors associated with Legionnaire's disease. It is an opportunistic disease, which means it takes the opportunity to infect a vulnerable individual or population, which can include immunocompromised individuals, people who have an immune system that isn't necessarily functioning at its strongest. elderly individuals, people who smoke, individuals with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is a lung disease, are at an increased risk as well. Organ transplant patients, individuals taking corticosteroid therapy that can also suppress your immune system and make you more vulnerable to diseases. And the heavy consumption of alcohol can also make you more vulnerable to contracting Legionellosis. The transmission of Legionnaire's disease, so how people can actually get the disease, includes some factors like the level of contamination, so the amount of the Legionella bacteria that an individual is exposed to can definitely impact whether somebody will get the disease or not. The intensity of exposure to contaminated water, so how long were you kind of exposed to the contaminated water? Was it a short burst and the individual was no longer exposed to it, or was somebody repeatedly exposed to some contaminated water? Can impact the possibility of getting Legionnaire's disease. And then an individual's susceptibility, which we kind of touched on the risk factors in the previous slide, how likely somebody is to contract a disease like this. So you get it by inhaling aerosols, so kind of like Legionella that is carried on small droplets of water that's actually breathed in by an individual, or the aspiration of contaminated water. So if you take a sip of contaminated water and you swallow it, you're not going to get the disease. But if you choked and actually ended up breathing in that contaminated water, that is another way that you can contract Legionnaire's disease. It is not contagious. So there is one documented case of person-to-person transmission. However, all the other thousands of documented cases, they come from an exposure to water and not from being around an individual who has the disease. As previously mentioned, there are two diseases caused by Legionellosis. The first and more severe is Legionnaire's disease. The incubation period, so the amount of time that it takes for the disease to start showing symptoms, can be anywhere from 2 to 10 days. The symptoms can range from a mild cough to a low fever to pneumonia and coma. Some early symptoms of the disease are malaise, so just a general feeling of illness or discomfort, muscle aches, or a slight headache. And then later symptoms can be a high fever, dry cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, and GI or upset stomach symptoms. Pontiac fever, which is the lesser form of disease caused by Legionella, kind of like the flu, the incubation period is 1 to 3 days. You start to show symptoms after exposure to the bacteria. And symptoms range are flu-like symptoms, but no pneumonia in your lungs from Pontiac fever. And typically full recovery in 2 to 5 days without medical intervention. Quite different from Legionnaire's disease. The source of contamination for Legionella, and kind of the reason we're here today, is to talk about the hot water systems that are kept below 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and they create aerosols. The main thing you might be thinking of is a shower. A shower head creates a nice mist and a nice vessel for Legionella to be transmitted from the water supply into someone's lungs, because you're standing in that mister in the shower. Another common source is a cooling tower, which is part of a air conditioning system or a building system, which actually can aerosolize water that is contaminated with Legionella, and big fan kicks on and spews it out into the atmosphere. So we also try and make sure that our cooling tower water is nice and safe as well. Less common sources, humidifiers. A decorative fountain, you guys know we have one here on campus in Fountain Court. That big fountain can also be a big source of contamination and Legionella disbursement. And finally, spas and whirlpools, so jacuzzis, and spas that you sit in. Nice growth temperature for Legionella, and unless it's chemically treated, it can be contaminated with Legionella and breathed in by an individual. So the main kind of last line of defense that you can use to protect yourself. So you wanna use flushing, you wanna use temperature control, you wanna use disinfectant, and kind of the last line of defense is this N95 respirator. Using it around cooling towers is not required. We can do a voluntary form, and we can schedule a fit test, and make sure that if you want to wear an N95 to protect yourself around cooling towers or while flushing, that you can opt to wear an N95. This mask is the only mask that can filter appropriately for Legionella bacteria. So moving on to our kind of why we're doing what we're doing and what our program is. So the concerns surrounding the low occupancy during the COVID-19 shutdown. Low occupancy means little to no water movement throughout the building. It can lead to stagnation, increased water age, that no movement, no flow situation. And there's concerns definitely that get increased by reduced use buildings or closure. So you have a decrease in that disinfectant level that's provided from the city, from the main, that chlorine in this case. You have an increase in biofilm. Biofilm is that slimy gook that we can see it in streams and rivers. It's on the inside of our pipes and shower heads. Here's a really gross example of biofilm in a small diameter stainless steel pipe. And what you have here is tons of bacteria, just layer upon layer upon layer, that can live in this film. And you're not, even though you're passing disinfectant maybe through this part here, you might be killing this bacteria. You have all this bacteria that's still living and surviving within the biofilm. So that's definitely an increased risk for Legionella in our situation with reduced use in our buildings. Microorganisms, they can grow on pipes, fixtures, tanks, and temperatures that promote the growth of Legionella. Remember, we talked about the 68 to 122 degree temperature range can definitely promote not just Legionella, but Mycobacterium, which is also a concern, and lead release if we have temperatures that don't meet our guidelines. I know we're really focusing on Legionella. I did also want to remind everybody that there's not just Legionella to be concerned with here. We also have other diseases and concerns that are associated with the shutdown or reduced operation of our buildings here on campus. So I mentioned Legionella, of course. Lead and copper contamination, which can happen when water is sitting in a pipe and the disinfectant is gone, and lead and copper actually get leached out of the material and into the water supply. Environmental Mycobacterium, there's some examples here of Mycobacterium that can cause diseases that can grow when we are in a situation like we're at now. And Naegleria fowleri, which is also a concern. This isn't all of them, of course. It's just a reminder that there's a lot more reasons than Legionella to make sure that our building water systems are flushed and safe. How do we take action? We are completing our routine flushing program and documenting it in our WebTMA system. Not only do we bring fresh water into the building, which is ideal to remove that stagnant water that's been sitting, but also by maintaining our temperatures that inhibit Legionella growth. Like the McDLT, we keep the cold water cold. We want to keep our hot water hot. The McDLT kept the hot stuff hot and kept the cold stuff cold. And we want to use the system design to our advantage by maintaining that water temperature less than 68 degrees on the cold side, and generation temperature ideally at 140 degrees or above on the hot side. This also helps inhibit Legionella growth within our buildings. The last thing that the routine flushing does is it restores the disinfectant levels, that chlorine that's provided to us by the city. We are flushing out the stagnant, reduced disinfectant levels and returning with increased disinfectant levels that's provided by the city. So our Wayne State routine flushing program is outlined here. We flush each building weekly with a final flush immediately prior to occupancy. We don't know when that is going to be yet, the occupancy. So our guidelines are to start low. We start flushing at the lowest level of the building. We want to open and flush all outlets for a minimum of 4 minutes. And we don't want to forget to flush both hot and cold water for 4 minutes. We want to remember to flush toilets, urinals, custodial sinks, drinking fountains, and bottle filling stations. All of these will help draw in that fresh water, replace the disinfectant, get water moving throughout the building, and get a low level of exposure to our occupants. We also want to record the locations and the fixtures that are flushed in TMA. Next, we move up. So we start low, we move up to the next highest floor, and we just repeat that flushing protocol. How I've been doing it is I start at the lowest level, closest to the main, and I move throughout the floor and then up through the building. And by the time I've finished flushing the hot water, I can go back to the beginning and turn it over to cold water and repeat my process. And at the end, then it's been 4 minutes, both hot and cold. I start back at the beginning and I turn everything off. And then we want to document. So there will be TMA work orders that are generated every week, and we want to make sure that we document that we are following the program as designed. Heaven forbid somebody gets sick, we would be able to say that we followed our program, we followed industry best practices, and we did everything we could do to keep our staff, faculty, and students safe. This is a nice little pictogram that kind of talks about the flushing from the service line. So you have the water main that comes in, goes into the building, passes through the meter, and kind of, hits some mechanical equipment. Here's a sink we have here. And it just shows the importance of actually drawing. You start low, you draw in fresh water here, you move your way up, and you're drawing in fresh water in each level. And don't forget about these distal or further away locations that we also want to hit, right? We want to make sure that we don't neglect an entire line of pipe to be flushed. Nice little pictogram for us. Here's some additional resources just in case anybody wants to do some more research on the guidance for plumbing and flushing. At the beginning of COVID, there was hardly any instruction on how to keep our buildings safe, but since shutdowns have happened in the past 7 months, 8-9 months, a lot of agencies have come out with recommendations, and we are following them to make sure that we are keeping everybody safe. A huge thank you to everyone for taking the time to watch this presentation, to understand the flushing program and the reasons that we've developed it. Here is my email and my phone number. If you have any questions or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And everybody stay safe, and hopefully we can get back to our normal occupancy very soon.